On the night Vivian Marlowe was supposed to celebrate 12 years of marriage, she stood outside her husband's study and heard him laugh, cold, cutting, cruel, as he told his mistress exactly what he thought of his brilliant wife. "She's useful," Damien said. "Nothing more." In that moment, something inside Vivian didn't break. It calcified. By the time she walked into her own charity gala and saw him parade his mistress through the crowd, Vivian had already made her decision. She wasn't going to leave him. She was going to erase him. Want to see how far a woman can go when she stops being invisible? Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The champagne was French. The flowers were Ecuadorian roses, flown in that morning. The string quartet played something soft and forgettable in the corner of the ballroom, the kind of music that was meant to fade into the background of polite conversation and clinking crystal. Vivian Marlowe stood at the edge of her own charity gala and felt nothing, not pride, not satisfaction, not even the hollow pleasure of a job well done. She'd organized this event down to the napkin rings, had spent 3 months courting donors and schmoozing with the city's most powerful players, all to raise money for a cause she actually believed in, legal aid for women trapped in impossible situations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wore midnight blue tonight, silk that moved like water, cut low enough to be elegant, but not so low anyone would call it desperate. Her dark hair was pulled back in a twist that had taken her stylist 40 minutes to perfect, and her makeup was flawless in that expensive, invisible way that made people think you woke up looking like money. She looked perfect because she always looked perfect. That was the job. "Mrs. Carrera." A man in a tuxedo appeared at her elbow, one of the gala's sponsors. "Wonderful event, simply wonderful." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." Her smile was automatic, practiced. "Your generosity made it possible." "Not at all, not at all. Where's that husband of yours? I wanted to congratulate him on the Mitchell acquisition. Brilliant move." Vivian's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure he'll be here shortly. You know Damien, always fashionably late." Brennan laughed like she'd said something clever instead of something she'd been saying for 12 years, and then he moved on to work the room. Vivian's smile dropped the second his back was turned. She knew exactly where Damien was. She'd known for 3 hours now, ever since her assistant had sent her the text with the restaurant name and the words, "Sorry, V, thought you should know." He was with her, the mistress, the one who'd been a fixture in Damien's life for the past 8 months, though Vivian suspected it had been longer. She'd seen the signs, the late nights that turned into early mornings, the phone calls he took in other rooms, the way he'd stopped touching her even in those perfunctory ways married people touched each other, a hand on the small of her back, a kiss on the cheek in public. He'd stopped pretending, and Vivian had stopped caring. Or so she'd thought. "Vivian!" A woman in emerald green descended on her, air-kissing both cheeks. "Patricia something. Old money, new face. Darling, this is spectacular. You've outdone yourself." "You're too kind." "I was just telling Richard, you remember my husband, Richard. I was telling him that you should be running the whole city, the way you pulled this together, while managing Damien's schedule and all those business interests. You're a miracle worker." Vivian's jaw ached from smiling. "Team effort." "Oh, don't be modest. Everyone knows you're the brains behind the operation." Patricia leaned in, lowering her voice to that conspiratorial whisper wealthy women used when they wanted to pretend they were being genuine. "Between us, half the men in this room would be in prison or bankruptcy without their wives cleaning up their messes. You're just better at it than most." She swept away before Vivian could respond, leaving behind a cloud of perfume and casual cruelty. The brains behind the operation. If only Patricia knew how right she was. Vivian moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for over a decade. She knew how to work a room, how to make people feel seen and important, how to extract commitments and donations with nothing more than a well-timed laugh and a touch on the arm. She'd learned it all from Damien in those early years, back when she'd thought they were building something together. God, she'd been stupid, not naive. Vivian had never been naive. She'd known exactly who Damien Carrera was when she married him. She'd known about the shell companies and the offshore accounts, the loans that weren't really loans, and the business deals that happened in the back rooms of restaurants she'd never heard of. She'd known he was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the kind of power that bent the world to its will. She'd married him anyway because she'd been 23 and brilliant and tired of being invisible. Damien had seen her, really seen her, or so she'd thought. He'd watched her dismantle a prosecutor's case against one of his associates using nothing but public records and a photographic memory, and he'd looked at her like she was magic. "Marry me," he'd said 3 weeks later, and Vivian had said yes because she'd wanted to matter to someone. She'd wanted to be more than the scholarship student from nowhere who'd clawed her way through law school on pure spite and student loans. She'd wanted to be seen. 12 years later, she was still invisible, just in a different way. "There she is," a familiar voice cut through her thoughts. "The woman of the hour." Vivian turned to find Marcus Chen, Damien's attorney, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. He handed her one and clinked his glass against hers before she could refuse. "To Vivian Carrera," he said. "The only person in this city who could get Judge Rothman and Senator Valdez in the same room without bloodshed." "They're on opposite sides of the ballroom," Vivian said dryly. "Exactly." Marcus grinned. He was younger than Damien by 5 years, handsome in that polished way lawyers were handsome, and one of the few people in Damien's orbit who'd ever treated Vivian like she had a brain. "Seriously, though, this is impressive. You've got half the city's power structure in this room, and they're all opening their checkbooks for you." "For the cause," Vivian corrected. "Right, the cause." Marcus took a sip of his champagne, his expression turning serious. "Speaking of which, has Damien seen the final donor list?" "Not yet. Why?" "No reason, just some of these names might make him twitchy. Judge Reeves is here. DA's office sent someone. Even that FBI agent, what's his name, Bob?" "Keller," Vivian said quietly. "Agent Keller." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You invited a federal agent to your charity gala?" "I invited someone who wrote a generous check to support legal aid. What he does for a living is irrelevant." "Vivian." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know damn well it's not irrelevant. If Damien sees—" "Damien isn't here," Vivian said, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus stop mid-sentence. She took a breath, smoothed her expression back into neutrality. "And even if he were, Agent Keller is a guest like anyone else. This is a charity event, Marcus, not a crime scene." Marcus studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You okay?" "Perfect," Vivian lied. "Why wouldn't I be?" Before Marcus could answer, a ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Vivian didn't need to look to know what, or who, had just arrived. She turned anyway. Damien Carrera stood in the entrance to the ballroom like he owned it, which, in a sense, he did. He'd donated enough money to this hotel over the years that the manager probably had his picture in a shrine somewhere. He wore a tuxedo the way some men wore armor, and his salt and pepper hair was styled in that casually perfect way that probably cost more than most people's car payments. He looked good. Damien always looked good. And on his arm, draped in red silk and diamonds, Vivian knew for a fact hadn't come from any of the collections Damien kept in the safe at home, was her. Serena Voss, 28, former model, current consultant for one of Damien's legitimate businesses. Future nobody once Damien got bored. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads, long legs, perfect features, the sort of effortless sensuality that some women were born with and others spent fortunes trying to achieve. Vivian had seen dozens of Serenas over the years. Different faces, same function. They usually lasted 6 months. Serena had made it to 8, which meant either she was smarter than the others or Damien was getting sloppy. The crowd shifted, creating a path as Damien and Serena moved into the room. People smiled, nodded, pretended they didn't notice the mistress on the mobster's arm. This was the world Vivian lived in, a world where power trumped propriety, where everyone saw everything and said nothing. Vivian stood perfectly still as Damien's eyes found hers across the ballroom. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by that easy confidence that had always been his armor. He said something to Serena, who laughed and touched his chest with one perfectly manicured hand. Then he started walking toward Vivian. "You want me to—" Marcus started. "No," Vivian said quietly. I've got this. Damien crossed the ballroom like he was crossing his own living room, and the crowd parted for him because the crowd always parted for him. When he reached Vivian, he smiled that smile that had once made her heart race and now made her stomach turn. Beautiful event, he said, and his voice was warm, affectionate even, like they were still the couple people thought they were. Like he hadn't been screwing Serena in the penthouse Vivian had personally decorated. You've outdone yourself, Viv. Vivian's smile was perfect, practiced, empty. Thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it. Damien's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of possession disguised as affection. He leaned in close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that Serena had probably picked out. Sorry we're late. Business ran long. Business, right. Vivian's eyes flicked to Serena, who was standing a careful 3 feet away, looking around the ballroom with the bright-eyed interest of someone who'd never seen this much wealth and power in one place. She was pretty up close, Vivian had to admit. Younger than Vivian by almost 15 years, with that fresh-faced quality that would fade in a decade or so when reality caught up with her. Mrs. Carrera. Serena's voice was surprisingly soft, almost uncertain. It's such an honor to be here. The work you're doing for these women, it's really incredible. Vivian looked at her, really looked at her, saw the nerves beneath the polish, the way Serena's hands were clasped too tightly in front of her, the almost desperate need for approval in her eyes. She was young. God, she was so young. Thank you, Vivian said, and her voice came out gentler than she'd intended. That's kind of you to say. Damien's hand tightened on Vivian's back. Serena's been telling me she wants to get more involved in charity work. I told her there's no one better to learn from than you. The audacity of it nearly made Vivian laugh. Here was her husband, standing in the middle of her charity gala with his mistress on his arm, suggesting that Mistress should spend more time with the wife he was betraying. It would be funny if it wasn't so perfectly, devastatingly cruel. I'm sure Serena has many talents, Vivian said smoothly. She doesn't need my guidance. Something flashed in Damien's eyes. Warning, maybe, or irritation. But before he could respond, Senator Valdez materialized at his elbow, already launching into a conversation about upcoming legislation. Damien's attention shifted instantly, his hand dropping from Vivian's back as he turned to engage with the senator. Serena lingered for a moment, looking uncertain. Then she offered Vivian a small, almost apologetic smile and drifted away toward the bar. Vivian stood there for 3 seconds. 5. 10. Watching her husband work the room like he hadn't just humiliated her in front of half the city's elite. Watching people pretend not to notice, not to care, because Damien Carrera's money and power made him untouchable. And in that moment, standing in the middle of her own event, surrounded by people who knew her name but didn't know her at all, Vivian felt something shift inside her chest, not her heart breaking. Hearts broke when you still cared. This was different. This was the sound of a door closing, a lock clicking shut, a decision being made with the cold, clear precision of someone who'd finally run out of reasons to stay. She turned and walked out of the ballroom. The hotel's business center was deserted at this hour, which was exactly why Vivian had chosen it. She sat down at one of the computers, her silk dress whispering against the leather chair, and stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then she logged in. Not to her personal email, not to anything that could be traced back to her easily. She logged into an account she'd set up 3 years ago, when she'd first started to suspect that her marriage was less a partnership and more a carefully constructed lie. An account Damien didn't know about. That no one knew about. The password was 20 characters long, a random string of letters and numbers she'd memorized. The kind of password that would take years to crack, even with sophisticated software. Vivian's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She'd been building this for years, quietly, carefully. Every shell company she'd set up for Damien, every offshore account she'd created, every legal shield she'd constructed to keep his empire running, she'd left herself a back door, a way in, a kill switch, if it ever came to that. She'd told herself it was insurance, protection, in case Damien ever decided she knew too much, in case he ever decided to handle her the way he handled other problems. But that wasn't why she'd done it. Not really. She'd done it because some part of her had known, even back then, that this day was coming, that eventually she'd stand in a room full of people who respected her work, but not her, married to a man who valued her skills, but not her soul, and she'd have to choose. Stay invisible, or burn it all down. Vivian opened the first file. Bus. She worked for 2 hours in that quiet business center, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of focused intensity that had made her the youngest person ever to pass the bar in her state. Around her, the gala continued. She could hear the distant sound of music, laughter, the clink of glasses. It all felt very far away. The first thing she did was access the central server that housed all of Damien's financial records. The legitimate ones, and the ones that only existed in encrypted files buried under layers of shell companies and dummy corporations. She'd set up most of them herself, back when she'd still thought they were building something together. Funny how naive she'd been. The Mitchell acquisition Brennan had mentioned earlier? That had been Vivian's work. She'd found the angle, structured the deal, created the legal framework that made it look clean when it was anything but. Damien had walked into the final meeting and signed the papers, but Vivian had done everything else. She always did everything else. Now she unmade it. Not all at once, that would be too obvious, too traceable. Vivian was smarter than that. She didn't delete files or wipe servers. Instead, she changed things, small things. A decimal point here, a transfer date there. Account numbers that were almost right, but not quite. The kind of errors that would look like incompetence or system glitches, not sabotage. The kind of errors that would make Damien's carefully balanced house of cards start to wobble. Working on your anniversary? Vivian's hands froze on the keyboard. She looked up to find Marcus Chen standing in the doorway of the business center, his bow tie loose and his expression concerned. Hardly our anniversary, Vivian said, her voice steady despite the spike of adrenaline in her veins. That was this afternoon. This is just another Thursday night. Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. What are you doing, Vivian? Checking donor pledges, making sure everything's documented properly. Bullshit! Marcus crossed to her, his eyes on the screen, but Vivian had already minimized the windows, pulling up the gala's fundraising database instead. That's not the donor database. That's... He stopped. His eyes went wide. Vivian waited. Marcus was smart, one of the smartest lawyers she'd ever met. It wouldn't take him long to put the pieces together. Jesus Christ, Marcus said softly. Vivian, what are you doing? What does it look like I'm doing? It looks like you're committing corporate suicide. Damien will what? Vivian stood up, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus take a step back. Kill me? He needs me too much for that. Divorce me? I'd love to see him try to explain to a judge where all his money came from. He'll destroy you. No, Vivian said quietly. He'll try. And he'll fail. Because Damien doesn't actually know how any of this works. He thinks he does. He thinks he's some kind of criminal mastermind. But the truth is, I've been running his empire for 12 years while he takes meetings and fucks his assistants. Without me, he's just another thug with expensive suits and delusions of grandeur. Marcus stared at her like he'd never seen her before. You're serious? Completely. Why? Why now? What did he... Marcus stopped, understanding dawning on his face. The mistress. Serena. This has nothing to do with Serena. Vivian's voice was cold, clinical. This has to do with the fact that 3 hours ago, I stood outside Damien's study and listened to him tell her exactly what he thinks of me. That I'm useful, that I'm convenient, that I'm too smart to leave and too boring to love. She paused, letting the words settle in the air between them. He's not wrong, she continued. I am useful, I am convenient, and I was too smart to leave. Until tonight. But I'm done being convenient. I'm done being invisible. And I'm definitely done propping up a man who thinks my only value is how well I clean up his messes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You're going to start a war. No, I'm going to end one. Vivian sat back down, her hands returning to the keyboard. I've been fighting a war for 12 years, Marcus. Fighting to be seen, to be valued, to be something more than the woman behind the man. I'm tired of fighting, so I'm changing the rules. How? Vivian looked at him, really looked at him. Marcus had always been kind to her, had always treated her like she mattered. She didn't want to drag him down with her. Go back to the gala, she said softly. Forget you saw me here. Vivian, I mean it. What I'm doing, you don't want any part of this. You're a good lawyer, Marcus. You have a future. Don't let me ruin it. Marcus stood there, torn. Then he nodded slowly and turned toward the door. But before he left, he looked back at her one more time. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you were always too good for him. Then he was gone, and Vivian was alone again. She worked for another hour. By the time she was finished, she'd buried time bombs in every major deal Damien had running. Nothing that would explode immediately. She was smarter than that. But in 2 weeks, when the first quarterly reports came due, discrepancies would start to surface. Account numbers that didn't match, transfer records that showed money moving to places it shouldn't go, loans that were suddenly callable because the terms had mysteriously changed. It would look like incompetence at first, maybe even like embezzlement by someone in Damien's organization. By the time anyone figured out what had really happened, it would be too late. The empire Vivian had spent 12 years building would come crashing down, and there would be nothing Damien could do to stop it. She closed the final file and logged out, wiping her digital fingerprints as she went. Then she stood, smoothed down her dress, and checked her reflection in the darkened computer screen. She looked exactly the same, perfectly composed, elegantly neutral. No one would ever know. Vivian walked back to the ballroom with her head high and her heart quiet. The gala was still going strong. These things always ran late when there was free champagne and powerful people to network with. She found her place at the edge of the crowd and slipped back into her role seamlessly. Across the room, Damien was deep in conversation with Judge Rothman, probably greasing wheels or calling in favors. Serena stood nearby looking bored and checking her phone. Vivian watched them for a moment. Her husband, his mistress, the life she was about to leave behind. She felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a bone-deep satisfaction that came from knowing she'd finally taken control of her own story. Mrs. Carrera? A server appeared at her elbow with a tray of champagne. Can I get you anything? Vivian smiled. No, thank you. I have everything I need. And for the first time in 12 years, she meant it. The gala wrapped up around midnight. Donors filed out with promises to write checks, politicians made vague commitments about future support, and the catering staff began the slow process of breaking down the event. Vivian stood near the entrance, thanking people as they left. It was exhausting work, smiling and nodding and pretending she cared about their compliments. But she did it anyway because this was her event, and she'd see it through to the end. Damien had left an hour earlier, Serena trailing after him like a puppy. He'd found Vivian before he went, kissing her cheek in that performative way that looked affectionate but felt like ownership. Great job tonight, he'd said. We'll talk tomorrow about some of those donor connections. I think I can leverage a few of them for the waterfront project. Of course he could. Of course he'd already figured out how to use her work for his own ends. Vivian had smiled and nodded, and Damien had walked away without noticing that his wife hadn't said a word. Now, as the last guest trickled out and the staff began dimming lights, Vivian finally allowed herself to relax. Her feet ached in her heels, her jaw hurt from smiling, and she was fairly certain she'd shaken hands with at least 200 people tonight. But it was done. The gala was a success. More importantly, the other thing, the thing no one knew about, was also done. Hell of a night. Vivian turned to find Agent Keller standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He looked out of place in his standard government-issue suit, surrounded by the opulence of the hotel ballroom, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. Agent Keller, Vivian kept her voice neutral. I'm glad you could make it. Wouldn't have missed it. Your assistant sent me the invitation 3 times. Started to feel like divine intervention. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Or maybe just very persistent fundraising. We believe in our cause. I can see that. Keller looked around the emptying ballroom. Impressive guest list, lot of important people, lot of powerful people. It's for a good cause, Vivian said carefully. Legal aid for women in crisis. Everyone should care about that. True enough. Keller's gaze returned to her. Your husband left early. It wasn't a question. Damien had other commitments. I'm sure he did. Keller pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. Mrs. Carrera, I want you to know, if you ever need help, my door is open. Vivian looked at the card but didn't take it. Why would I need help, Agent Keller? Maybe you wouldn't. But in my experience, people who organize galas for women in crisis usually understand that crisis personally. He set the card on the table next to her, just in case. Then he walked away, leaving Vivian alone with his card and the weight of what he hadn't said. She picked up the card, studied it for a moment, then slipped it into her clutch. She didn't need Agent Keller's help. She didn't need anyone's help. But it was always good to have options. Vivian got home a little after 1 in the morning. The penthouse was dark and silent. Damien wasn't here, which meant he was at one of his other properties. Probably the place he kept for Serena, the one he thought Vivian didn't know about. She kicked off her heels in the entryway and walked barefoot across the marble floor, her dress whispering around her legs. The city glittered below her through floor-to-ceiling windows, a constellation of lights and lives and stories she'd never be part of. Vivian poured herself a glass of wine, something expensive from Damien's collection, and stood at the window, looking out at the city she'd helped her husband conquer. 12 years. 12 years of being brilliant and invisible, of building empires for a man who couldn't even be bothered to come home on their anniversary. But that was ending now. Vivian raised her glass to her reflection in the window, to the woman she'd been and the woman she was about to become. To new beginnings, she said to the empty room. Then she drank, and the wine tasted like freedom. The wine was still sitting on her tongue when her phone buzzed. Vivian looked down at the screen and saw Damien's name glowing in the darkness. Don't wait up. 3 words, not even an excuse this time. Just a command delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never had to explain himself. Vivian deleted the message without responding. Then she finished her wine, rinsed the glass, and went to bed in the guest room she'd been using for the past 6 months. The sheets were cold and impersonal, but at least they were hers. She slept better than she had in years. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows and Damien still wasn't home. Vivian made coffee in the kitchen that was almost never used, they had staff for that normally, and checked her phone while the machine hissed and gurgled. 3 missed calls from Patricia in Emerald Green, probably wanting to gossip about the gala. 2 emails from the charity thanking her for her work. 1 text from Marcus that just said, "Call me when you can." Nothing from Damien. Vivian sipped her coffee and opened her laptop. Not the personal one. She had another device, a tablet she kept locked in a safe disguised as a decorative box in her closet. The kind of safe Damien would never think to look for because he assumed everything valuable in this penthouse already belonged to him. She logged into the secondary account she'd been building for 3 years. The ones that existed in her maiden name, buried under layers of legitimate business transactions and perfectly legal tax shelters. While Damien had been busy expanding his criminal empire, Vivian had been quietly building a legitimate one. Real estate investments, stock portfolios. A consulting firm that operated under an LLC with her name nowhere on the paperwork. She'd been siphoning money from Damien's operations for years, never enough to notice, just a percentage point here and there, routing it through enough channels that it looked like normal business expenses or charitable donations. The total sat at just over $42 million. Vivian stared at that number for a long time. $42 million. More than enough to disappear. More than enough to start over. More than enough to never have to smile through another humiliation or pretend she didn't hear the whispers that followed her at every charity event. But disappearing wasn't what Vivian wanted. Not anymore. She closed the laptop and drank her coffee, watching the city wake up below her. The streets filled with cars and people rushing to jobs and lives that had nothing to do with her. Somewhere out there, Damien was probably still in bed with Serena, or maybe he was already up and working, making deals and breaking rules and trusting that Vivian would clean up whatever mess he made. He had no idea what was coming. The first sign of trouble appeared 3 days later. Vivian was in her home office, the small room off the kitchen that Damien had grudgingly let her claim, when her phone rang. Not her personal phone, the burner she kept for handling Damien's more sensitive business matters. She almost didn't answer it, but old habits died hard. Yes? Mrs. Carrera? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, nervous. This is Derek Chen from Pacific Rim Investments. I'm calling about the Mitchell acquisition. Vivian's fingers stilled on her keyboard. Pacific Rim was one of the shell companies she'd set up to funnel money through the Mitchell deal. What about it? There's been a discrepancy in the account transfers. The funds that were supposed to clear on the 15th are showing as routed to an incorrect account. I've been trying to track down the error, but the transfer codes don't match our records and— Slow down, Vivian said, her voice calm despite the spike of adrenaline in her chest. What exactly are you seeing? Derek walked her through it. The wrong account numbers, the mismatched dates, the transfer amounts that were off by decimal points. Small errors, individually. But collectively, they added up to millions of dollars that were now sitting in limbo, untraceable and inaccessible, exactly as Vivian had designed it. I need you to send me everything, she said. Every document, every transfer record, every email chain. Can you do that? Of course. But Mr. Carrera is going to— Let me worry about Mr. Carrera. You focus on documentation. I'll handle the rest. She hung up before Derek could argue. Then she sat back in her chair and allowed herself a small, cold smile. It was starting. The calls came in steadily over the next week. Different voices, same story, account errors, transfer failures, missing documentation. Nothing catastrophic yet. These were all problems that could theoretically be fixed given enough time and resources. But they required attention, required explanations, required Vivian to dive back into the systems she'd built and untangle the messes she'd deliberately created. Except Vivian wasn't untangling anything. She was making it worse. Every time someone called with a problem, she'd promise to look into it. Then she'd access the relevant accounts and change a few more numbers, create a few more errors, route money through a few more dead-end shell companies. She worked carefully, methodically, creating chaos that looked like incompetence instead of sabotage. And all the while, Damien noticed nothing. He was too busy with the waterfront project he'd mentioned at the gala, some massive development deal that required bribing half the city council and threatening the other half. Vivian had set up the initial framework months ago, but now Damien was handling the day-to-day operations himself, which meant he was barely home and even more distracted than usual. Serena had moved into the penthouse. Not officially, Damien still had enough sense not to be that blatant, but her things were everywhere. Designer shoes in the closet, expensive skincare products in the bathroom, a silk robe hanging on the back of the bedroom door. Vivian saw it all and said nothing. She'd moved her remaining belongings into the guest room and started spending her days in coffee shops and libraries, anywhere but the home that had stopped feeling like hers months ago. You've been quiet lately. Vivian looked up from her laptop to find Marcus sliding into the chair across from her. She was at a corner table in a cafe near the financial district, buried in spreadsheets that had nothing to do with Damien's business and everything to do with her own. I've been busy, she said, so I've heard. Marcus ordered an espresso from a passing server, then turned his attention back to Vivian. Damien's been asking questions about the Mitchell deal, about Pacific Rim, about why his accounts aren't matching up the way they should. And what did you tell him? That these things happen, that probably someone in accounting screwed up, that you'd fix it. Marcus paused. You're not going to fix it, are you? Vivian closed her laptop. Do you want me to? I want you to be careful. Damien's paranoid on a good day. If he figures out what you're doing, he won't. You sound very sure of that. I am. Vivian leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus. He looked tired, she realized. There were shadows under his eyes and tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there a week ago. Is he making your life difficult? He's making everyone's life difficult. Half his associates think there's a rat in the organization. The other half thinks someone's trying to take him down from the outside. Marcus's espresso arrived, and he wrapped his hands around the cup like he needed the warmth. No one suspects you. Why would they? I'm just the wife. You're not just anything, Vivian, and that's the problem. Damien's so used to you being in the background that he can't see you even when you're standing right in front of him. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, grimaced. What's your end game here? You bring down his empire, then what? You think he's just going to let you walk away? I think Damien's going to be too busy trying to save himself to worry about me. And if you're wrong? Vivian didn't answer. She didn't have an answer, not one that Marcus would want to hear, because the truth was, she didn't care what happened to her after this. She'd spent 12 years being careful, being invisible, making herself small enough to fit into the spaces Damien allowed her. She was done with that. If burning down his empire meant burning herself too, then so be it. At least she'd finally be warm. Marcus seemed to read something in her silence. He set down his cup and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. There are other ways, you know, safer ways. You could just divorce him, take your half and disappear. My half? Vivian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, I built this empire. Every shell company, every offshore account, every legal loophole that keeps Damien out of prison. That was me. I'm not taking half. I'm taking everything. That's not divorce. That's war. No, Vivian said quietly. That's justice. The second wave hit 10 days after the gala. Vivian was in her office when her phone rang, her actual phone this time, not one of the burners. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer anyway. Mrs. Carrera? The voice was crisp, professional, female. This is Jennifer Hollis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I'm calling regarding some irregularities we've detected in several accounts associated with your husband's business interests. Vivian's pulse kicked up, but her voice stayed steady. What kind of irregularities? Multiple transfer violations, potential structuring to avoid reporting requirements, and some concerning patterns in international wire transfers. We're going to need to schedule a meeting to discuss our findings. Of course. I'll have Mr. Carrera's attorney contact you to... Actually, Mrs. Carrera, we were hoping to speak with you. Our records show you are listed as a signatory on most of these accounts, and your name appears on quite a bit of the documentation. Vivian's mind raced. She'd expected scrutiny, eventually. That was part of the plan, but not this fast, and not directly targeting her. I handle administrative work for my husband, Ms. Hollis. I'm not involved in the day-to-day financial operations. I understand. Nevertheless, we'll need to speak with you. Are you available tomorrow at 2? I'll have to check my schedule and get back to you. Mrs. Carrera, I should mention that this isn't optional. We can do this cooperatively, or we can do it with subpoenas. Your choice. Vivian closed her eyes. Tomorrow at 2 is fine. She hung up and sat very still, her heart pounding against her ribs. This wasn't part of the plan. She'd designed the chaos to eventually draw federal attention to Damien's operations. But she'd been careful to keep her own name insulated, buried under layers of plausible deniability. Apparently, she hadn't been careful enough. Her phone buzzed with a text. Marcus. Need to talk. Now. They met in a parking garage 3 blocks from Vivian's building. Marcus's car was running, heat blasting against the November cold. Vivian slid into the passenger seat and waited. The FBI is sniffing around, Marcus said, without preamble. Not just the Fed Reserve. Actual FBI. They've been interviewing people, pulling records, asking questions about Damien's business dealings. How bad? Bad enough that I'm thinking about calling my own lawyer. Marcus's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Vivian, I need to know what you did, not the surface stuff. I need to know everything. Because right now, it looks like someone handed the feds a roadmap to every illegal thing Damien's done in the last decade, and I need to know if that someone was you. Vivian stared straight ahead through the windshield. I changed some numbers, created some discrepancies, made it look like someone in the organization was either incompetent or stealing. That's it? That's it. You didn't contact the authorities? Didn't hand over evidence? No. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, they're going to think you did. Damien's going to think you did. And when he figures out all these problems started right after the gala, let him think whatever he wants. I've got documentation showing every change was made from terminal computers at hotels and coffee shops all over the city. I've been careful, Marcus. My digital fingerprints are nowhere near any of this. Digital fingerprints aren't the only kind that matter. Marcus finally looked at her. If the FBI comes knocking, if they start asking questions, you need to lawyer up immediately. Don't talk to them. Don't try to explain. Don't do anything without representation. I know how this works. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've just painted a target on your back and you're acting like you're bulletproof. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. I don't want to read about you in the obituaries, Vivian. Damien's done worse for less. Damien needs me. He needed you. Past tense. The second the Fed started circling, you stopped being an asset and started being a liability. Marcus pulled a business card from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. This is Sarah Chen, the best criminal defense attorney in the state. Call her. Today. Please. Vivian looked down at the card. The name meant nothing to her, but the address was in one of the city's most expensive buildings. I can't afford. I'll cover it. Consider it payment for all the times you've saved my ass over the years. Marcus's expression softened slightly. You were right, at the gala. You are too good for him. You always were. But being too good for someone doesn't make you safe from them. Vivian tucked the card into her purse. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just stay alive long enough to see him fall. The meeting with Jennifer Hollis lasted 3 hours and felt like 3 years. Vivian sat across from the federal agent in a sterile conference room at the Reserve Bank, a lawyer she'd never met before sitting beside her. Not Sarah Chen. Vivian had chickened out at the last minute and called a different attorney, someone cheaper and less connected to Marcus. It was probably a mistake, but Vivian was making a lot of those lately. Hollis walked her through transaction after transaction, account after account. She had printouts, spreadsheets, highlighted sections that supposedly proved systematic fraud and money laundering. And in every single one, Vivian's name appeared somewhere. Signatory, administrator, point of contact. I need you to understand the situation you're in, Mrs. Carrera, Hollis said, her voice almost gentle. These accounts show clear evidence of criminal activity. Structuring, tax evasion, possible RICO violations. We have enough here to bring charges against multiple people, including you. Vivian's lawyer started to object, but Vivian spoke over him. I did administrative work. I signed papers my husband told me to sign. That's not illegal. It is if you knew what those papers represented. I didn't. Really? Hollis pulled out another document. This is an email from you to a financial consultant in the Cayman Islands, dated 14 months ago. You're discussing the best way to structure a series of shell companies to minimize exposure and maintain operational flexibility. That doesn't sound like someone who's just signing papers. Vivian's stomach dropped. She'd written that email, had spent hours crafting the language to make the illegal look legal. She'd just never thought anyone would see it. I want to help you, Mrs. Carrera, Hollis continued. I really do. But I can only do that if you're willing to cooperate. Tell us what you know about your husband's operations. Give us testimony, documentation, anything that can help us build a case against the people actually running these criminal enterprises. And in exchange, immunity. Full cooperation means full protection. You help us, we help you. Vivian looked at her lawyer, who was nodding slightly. It was a good deal. Probably the best deal she was going to get. But it wasn't the deal Vivian wanted. I'd like to consult with my attorney before making any decisions, she said. Hollis's expression hardened. Mrs. Carrera, this offer has a shelf life. The longer you wait, I understand. I still need time to think. The meeting ended shortly after that, with Hollis's card pressed into Vivian's hand and a warning that she had 48 hours to decide. Vivian walked out of that building and straight into the first bar she found. She ordered scotch, expensive, neat, and sat at the counter trying to figure out how everything had spiraled so far out of her control so fast. She'd wanted Damien's empire to crumble. She'd wanted him to feel powerless, to understand what it was like to watch everything you'd built fall apart, while people who were supposed to care about you just watched it happen. She hadn't wanted to go to prison for it. Her phone buzzed. Damien, finally. Where are you? Vivian stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, out. We need to talk. Now. About what? Don't play stupid, Vivian. Get home. She drained her scotch, left cash on the bar, and headed for the penthouse. Whatever was about to happen, she'd rather face it head on than spend the next few hours dreading it. Damien was waiting in the living room when she arrived. He wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits stood near the windows, and Serena was conspicuously absent. Vivian recognized one of the men, Vincent Russo, one of Damien's oldest associates, the kind of man who solved problems with violence and asked questions never. Close the door, Damien said. Vivian did. Her pulse was racing, but she kept her expression neutral. What's going on? You tell me. Damien stood, and there was something in his eyes Vivian had never seen before. Fear, maybe. Or fury so cold it looked like fear. I've got the FBI crawling up my ass. Accounts frozen, associates getting subpoenaed, and every business deal I've got running is falling apart because suddenly nothing is where it's supposed to be. So you tell me, Vivian, what the hell is going on? I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to explain how 12 years of perfect operations suddenly turned into a complete shit show the week after your little charity gala. Damien moved closer. I want you to explain why Jennifer Hollis from the Federal Reserve called me today and mentioned your name 16 times. I want you to explain why it looks like someone with intimate knowledge of my business handed the feds a gift-wrapped case against me. Vivian met his eyes. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking questions. There's a difference. Doesn't sound like questions. Sounds like you've already made up your mind. Vincent cleared his throat from across the room. Mrs. Carrera, we're just trying to understand the timeline here. You handle most of Mr. Carrera's administrative work, yes? I did. Past tense. And when did you stop? Vivian understood the game they were playing. Good cop, bad cop, except both cops worked for the mob and neither one of them cared if she lived or died. I've been gradually stepping back over the past few months. I told Damien I wanted to focus more on my charity work. Convenient timing, Vincent said mildly. Or maybe I just got tired of covering for a man who can't keep his dick in his pants long enough to remember his own anniversary. Vivian's voice was sharp, cutting. She watched Damien flinch and felt a savage satisfaction. You want to know what's going on? Fine. You've been sloppy. You've been distracted. You've been making deals without thinking through the legal implications because you assumed I'd be there to clean up your messes. Well, I'm not there anymore. So maybe this isn't sabotage. Maybe this is just what happens when you try to run a criminal empire without the person who actually knows how it works. The second man stepped forward. Vivian didn't know his name, but she recognized the type. Muscle. Enforcer. The kind of man who made problems disappear. Damien held up a hand, stopping him. Everyone out. Now. Vincent and the enforcer exchanged glances, but they left. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded too much like a lock. Vivian stood very still. Damien circled her slowly like a predator sizing up prey. 12 years, Vivian. 12 years you've been by my side. You think I don't know you? You think I can't tell when you're lying? I'm not lying. You're not telling the truth either. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Still the same one Serena had picked out. Here's what I think happened. I think you got your feelings hurt when I brought Serena to the gala. I think you decided to throw a tantrum and make my life difficult for a few weeks. And I think you didn't realize how far it would spiral, and now you're scared because the FBI is involved, and you don't know how to fix what you broke. Vivian laughed. She couldn't help it. The sound came out harsh and bitter, echoing in the too large room. Is that really what you think? That this is about Serena? What else would it be about? It's about the fact that I heard you, Damien. The night of our anniversary, I stood outside your study and I heard every word you said to her, about how I'm useful, about how I'm convenient, about how I'm too boring to love but too smart to leave. Vivian's voice cracked, just slightly. So no, this isn't a tantrum. This is me finally understanding my worth and realizing it's a hell of a lot more than you ever gave me credit for. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Vivian, don't! Don't you dare try to explain it away or tell me I misunderstood. I heard what I heard. And you know what the worst part is? You were right. I was too smart to leave. Until I wasn't. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, "What did you do?" "Nothing illegal. Bullshit. I changed some numbers, made some errors, created enough chaos that your house of cards started to wobble. That's all." Vivian met his eyes. "The FBI? The frozen accounts? The subpoenas? That's not me, Damien. That's you. That's 12 years of illegal activity finally catching up with you." "With us," Damien corrected. "Your name is on half those accounts. Your signature is on the documents. If I go down, you're coming with me." "Maybe. Or maybe the FBI will believe me when I tell them I was just following my husband's orders, that I had no idea what those accounts were really for." Vivian smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Who do you think they'll believe, Damien? The crime boss with a rap sheet, or the charity organizer who's been trying to help women escape abusive situations?" Damien's hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "You think you're untouchable? You think I won't Won't what? Kill me? Go ahead. See how well that plays with the FBI agents who are already building a case against you. Vivian didn't pull away. Or maybe you'll just threaten me, try to scare me into cleaning up this mess like I've cleaned up every other mess you've made. But here's the thing, Damien. I'm not scared anymore. I'm just tired. He released her arm, stepping back like she'd burned him. I loved you. No, you didn't. You loved what I could do for you. There's a difference. Vivian, I'm leaving. Tonight. I'm going to pack a bag and walk out that door, and you're not going to stop me. She headed toward the guest room, then paused and looked back. And Damien, if anything happens to me, if I disappear or have an accident or mysteriously overdose, I've got documentation that goes straight to the FBI. Everything. Account numbers, shell companies, recordings of conversations, emails, all of it. So if you're thinking about solving this problem the way you usually solve problems, think again. It was a bluff. She had documentation, yes, but it wasn't set up to automatically send anywhere. Still, Damien didn't know that. You're making a mistake, he said. Probably, but at least it's my mistake to make. Vivian packed quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into a suitcase without caring what matched or what didn't. She grabbed her laptop, her tablet, the burner phones, and the small safe that held her important documents. Everything else, the designer clothes, the jewelry, the life she'd built in this penthouse, she left behind. None of it had ever really been hers anyway. Damien didn't try to stop her when she walked out. He just stood in the living room and watched her go, his expression unreadable. The last thing Vivian saw before the elevator doors closed was Serena emerging from the bedroom, looking rumpled and confused. She'd been there the whole time, listening to everything. Vivian wondered if that would matter. Then she decided she didn't care. She checked into a hotel under a false name, paid in cash, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at her phone. Marcus had called 4 times. She should call him back. She should probably also call Sarah Chen, the criminal defense attorney, and start building her own protection. Instead, she pulled out Agent Keller's card and stared at it for a long time. Then she dialed. He answered on the second ring. Keller? Agent Keller, this is Vivian Carrera. We met at the charity gala. A pause. I remember. Are you all right, Mrs. Carrera? That depends on your definition of all right. Vivian took a breath. You said if I ever needed help, your door was open. Does that offer still stand? It does. Then I think we should talk, but not over the phone. I can meet you. Name the place. Vivian gave him the address of a diner she'd passed on the way to the hotel. Public, busy, safe. 1 hour. I'll be there. She hung up and sat in the silence of the hotel room, listening to the sounds of the city through thin walls. Somewhere out there, Damien was probably making calls, mobilizing his lawyers, trying to figure out how to contain the damage she'd caused. Let him try. Vivian stood, smoothed down her clothes, and checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked tired. She looked scared. She looked free. Then she grabbed her coat and headed out to make a deal with the devil she didn't know, in hopes of escaping the one she did. The diner smelled like coffee and grease and decades of other people's conversations. Vivian slid into a booth near the back, her coat still buttoned up despite the overheated interior, and ordered coffee she had no intention of drinking. The waitress looked about 19 and completely uninterested in Vivian's existence, which was exactly what Vivian needed right now. Agent Keller arrived 12 minutes later. He spotted her immediately, which told Vivian he'd probably been watching the entrance before he came in. He slid into the booth across from her without asking permission and ordered his own coffee. Thanks for meeting me, Vivian said. Thanks for calling. Keller had the kind of face that was hard to read, not unfriendly, but carefully neutral in a way that probably came from years of interviewing people who didn't want to talk. You sounded rattled on the phone. I am rattled. Want to tell me why? Vivian wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, even though it was too hot to hold comfortably. The pain kept her focused. How much do you know about my husband's business operations? Enough to know he's not just a successful businessman, not enough to make charges stick. Keller's eyes didn't leave her face. Yet. What if I could change that? Then I'd want to know what you're getting in exchange. Vivian appreciated the directness. No pretense, no dancing around the subject, just straight to the transaction. Immunity. Full immunity for anything I might have done while working for Damien. That's a big ask. I know, but I've got big information. Keller leaned back in his seat, considering. The waitress returned with his coffee, and he waited until she was gone before speaking again. Walk me through what you're offering. Everything. Shell companies, offshore accounts, money laundering operations, bribery records. The names of every judge and politician Damien's got in his pocket. 12 years of documentation. Vivian's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. I built his entire operation, Agent Keller. I know where everybody is buried, literally and figuratively. And you're willing to hand all that over? Yes. Why now? It was a fair question. Vivian had spent 12 years protecting Damien, building his empire, making sure he stayed untouchable. Why turn on him now? Because I'm done being invisible, she said quietly. And because the FBI is already investigating him, which means I'm already implicated whether I cooperate or not. At least this way, I have some control over the outcome. Keller studied her for a long moment. Then he said, You understand that if we do this, there's no going back. Once you start talking, you're committed. And Damien Carrera isn't the kind of man who forgives betrayal. I know. You'll need protection. Witness protection, probably. New identity, new city, new life. Everything you know, everyone you've been, that all goes away. Vivian thought about the penthouse with Serena's things scattered everywhere. The charity galas where people praised her work but didn't know her name. The 12 years of being useful but not valued. Smart but not seen. I'm okay with that, she said. Keller pulled out his phone. I need to make a call. Bring in my supervisor, get this official. Don't go anywhere. He stepped outside and Vivian watched through the window as he paced and talked, his breath visible in the cold November air. She should have felt scared, should have felt guilty or conflicted or something other than this strange, hollow calm. But all she felt was tired. Keller came back inside with another man, older, gray-haired, wearing the same kind of forgettable suit that seemed to be FBI's standard issue. He introduced himself as Special Agent Morrison and slid into the booth next to Keller. Mrs. Carrera, Morrison said, Agent Keller tells me you want to cooperate. That's right. Before we go any further, I need to make something very clear. Cooperation means full cooperation. No holding back, no protecting anyone, no selective memory about things that might incriminate you. You give us everything, or we give you nothing. Understood? Understood. Morrison pulled out a small recording device and set it on the table. Then let's start with the basics. What exactly did you do for your husband? Vivian took a breath and started talking. She talked for 3 hours straight, pausing only when the waitress came by to refill their coffee or clear plates of food Vivian didn't remember ordering. She walked them through the shell companies, explaining how she'd layered them to make Damien's money nearly impossible to trace. She detailed the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Singapore, Switzerland, 14 different countries, 63 different banks. She gave them names. Associates, lawyers, accountants, politicians. She explained the bribery system, how much each judge cost, which senators were on the payroll, which police officers looked the other way for a monthly fee. She detailed the money laundering operations, the front businesses, the fake invoices and phantom employees that made dirty money look clean. And she told them about the violence. Not the kind Damien committed himself. He was too smart for that. But the kind he ordered. The warehouse fire that had killed 2 people who'd gotten in his way. The journalist who'd been asking too many questions and ended up in the river. The competitor who'd mysteriously vanished 3 years ago. Morrison and Keller listened without interrupting, their expressions carefully neutral. Vivian wondered what they were thinking, whether they believed her, whether they thought she was a victim or a co-conspirator, whether they thought she was any better than Damien. The documentation, Morrison said when she finally ran out of words. You said you have documentation for all of this? Most of it, yes. Account numbers, transfer records, email chains. I've been keeping copies of everything for years. Why? Insurance, Vivian said, in case Damien ever decided I knew too much. Smart. Morrison didn't sound approving or disapproving, just factual. Where is it? Safe deposit box. Different bank. Different name. I can get it tomorrow. We'll go with you. Vivian nodded. She'd expected that. Morrison glanced at Keller, some silent communication passing between them. Then he turned back to Vivian. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to verify what you've told us tonight. If it checks out, and I mean all of it, we'll talk to the U.S. attorney about an immunity deal. But I need you to understand something, Mrs. Carrera. Immunity doesn't mean you walk away clean. It means you don't go to prison. But your name is going to be all over this case. People will know you testified. Your life as Vivian Carrera is over. I know. Do you? Morrison leaned forward. Because in my experience, people think they know what they're signing up for, and then reality hits and they fall apart. You're going to testify against your husband. You're going to sit in a courtroom and detail every illegal thing he's done while he stares at you from the defense table. His lawyers are going to try to destroy you. They're going to paint you as a scorned wife, a liar, a criminal who's trying to save herself by destroying an innocent man. And that's before we talk about the physical danger. Damian Carrera has resources. He has people. And he's going to use all of it to make sure you never make it to trial. Vivian met his eyes. Then I guess you'd better keep me alive long enough to testify. Morrison almost smiled. Almost. We're going to try, but you need to follow our rules. Starting tonight, you don't go anywhere alone. You don't contact anyone from your old life. You don't use your credit cards or access your bank accounts. Anything you do can be traced, and anything that can be traced can be used against you. What about my things, my clothes, We'll get you what you need, but everything from your old life stays in your old life. Morrison stood. There's a safe house about 40 minutes outside the city. We're going to take you there tonight. You'll stay until we can verify your information and start building our case. Vivian thought about the hotel room she'd paid for in cash. The suitcase full of expensive clothes she'd probably never wear again. She thought about Marcus and whether he'd worry when she disappeared. She thought about the charity she'd built and the women she'd been helping and whether anyone would continue that work when she was gone. Then she thought about Damian's face when he realized she'd actually done it, when he understood that the invisible wife had been the most dangerous person in his life all along. Okay, she said, let's go. The safe house was exactly what it sounded like, a nondescript ranch house in a subdivision full of identical ranch houses, the kind of place where no one noticed their neighbors and everyone minded their own business. Keller drove while Morrison sat in back with Vivian, both agents constantly checking mirrors and side streets. Vivian watched the city disappear behind them and tried not to think about what came next. Two agents were waiting at the house when they arrived, a woman who introduced herself as Agent Park and a younger man whose name Vivian immediately forgot. They did a quick sweep of the property while Vivian stood in the driveway, still wearing her coat, still carrying nothing but her purse. Clear, Park said, emerging from the garage. No signs of surveillance, no vehicles in the area that don't belong. Morrison nodded. Mrs. Carrera, you're going to stay here for the next few days while we verify your information and coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Agents Park and Rodriguez will be with you at all times. You need something, you ask them. You want to make a phone call, you ask them. You want to step outside for fresh air, you ask them. Understood? Understood. Good. Morrison handed her a burner phone. This is for emergencies only. My number's programmed in. You see anything suspicious, you hear anything that concerns you, you call me immediately. Vivian took the phone and followed Park inside. The house was sterile and impersonal, decorated in that generic way that suggested no one actually lived there. Beige walls, brown carpet, furniture that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog. There was a small bedroom at the end of the hall that Park indicated would be hers. There's clothes in the closet, Park said. Probably not your style, but they'll fit well enough. Bathrooms across the hall. Kitchen stocked with basics. If you need anything else, let me know. Thank you. Park lingered in the doorway. She was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and eyes that had probably seen too much. Can I give you some advice, Mrs. Carrera? Please, get some sleep. I know that sounds impossible right now, but the next few weeks are going to be hell, and you need to be sharp. So sleep while you can, eat when food's available, and don't waste energy worrying about things you can't control. That's easier said than done. Everything worth doing is. Park offered a tight smile. I'll be in the living room if you need anything. Try to rest. She closed the door, and Vivian was alone. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank wall for a long time. Somewhere across the city, Damien was probably tearing apart the penthouse, looking for evidence of what she'd done. Somewhere, Marcus was fielding panicked calls from associates trying to figure out why their operations were falling apart. Somewhere, Serena was learning what it meant to be with a man whose world was collapsing. And here Vivian sat, in a house that wasn't hers, wearing clothes that didn't fit, having just betrayed the man she'd spent 12 years protecting. She should have felt guilty, should have felt something other than this bone-deep exhaustion, but all she felt was done. Vivian lay down without bothering to change clothes and closed her eyes. Sleep came faster than she expected, pulling her under like a tide she was too tired to fight. She dreamed of numbers and offshore accounts and Damien's voice, saying she was useful, nothing more. When she woke, it was morning, and someone was knocking on her door. "Mrs. Carrera?" Park's voice, calm and professional. "We need you in the living room." Vivian sat up, disoriented. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her back hurt from sleeping in her clothes. Then it all came rushing back. She found Park in the living room with Morrison and two other people she didn't recognize. A man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, and a woman with severe glasses who said her name was Linda Hayes, from the U.S. Attorney's office. "Mrs. Carrera," Chen said, gesturing to the couch. "Please sit. We need to discuss the parameters of your cooperation." Vivian sat. Her mouth tasted like stale coffee and regret. Chen opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "We've spent the night reviewing your preliminary statement and cross-referencing it with existing investigations. I'll be direct. What you've described would constitute one of the largest RICO cases this office has prosecuted in a decade. If even half of what you've told us is verifiable, we're looking at charges against dozens of individuals, including several sitting judges and at least 2 state senators." "It's all verifiable," Vivian said quietly. "We'll need to confirm that. Which brings us to the documentation you mentioned, the safe deposit box. I can take you there today." "We'll arrange that." Chen exchanged glances with Hayes. "But first, we need to discuss your immunity agreement. This is a preliminary draft, subject to revision once we've verified your claims. But the basic terms are as follows. Full immunity from prosecution for any crimes committed during your marriage to Damien Carrera, in exchange for complete cooperation including testimony at trial." He slid the document across the coffee table. Vivian picked it up and started reading. The legal language was dense, but she'd spent enough years working with contracts to understand the gist. She was trading her freedom for Damien's destruction, and the government was willing to make that trade. "There are conditions," Hayes said. She had the kind of voice that cut through bullshit like a scalpel through tissue. "You cannot contact your husband or any known associates. You cannot access joint accounts or shared assets. You will be required to surrender your passport and agree to GPS monitoring. And you will cooperate fully with our investigation, which means answering every question we ask, no matter how uncomfortable." "I understand." "Do you?" Hayes leaned forward. "Because I need you to understand what complete cooperation means. We're going to ask about things you probably don't want to discuss. Your marriage, your finances, your personal life. We're going to dig into every corner of your existence, looking for anything that might undermine your credibility as a witness. And if we find something, if we discover you've lied about anything, no matter how small, this deal disappears and you get charged along with everyone else." Vivian met her eyes. "I haven't lied." "Good. Then sign the preliminary agreement and let's go get that documentation." The bank was in a neighborhood Vivian had chosen specifically because it was nowhere near anywhere Damien ever went. She'd opened the safe deposit box 4 years ago under her maiden name, paying the annual fee in cash and visiting only when she was certain she wasn't being followed. Morrison and Keller flanked her as they walked into the building, while Park waited in the car and Rodriguez covered the entrance. To anyone watching, they probably looked like business associates or lawyers. No one looked twice. The bank manager was a nervous man in his 50s who kept glancing at Keller's badge like it might bite him. He led them downstairs to the vault and left them alone in one of the small private rooms. Vivian opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were 6 flash drives, 4 external hard drives, and a stack of papers 3 inches thick. She'd been collecting this information for years, copying files, downloading records, printing emails that might someday prove useful. At first, it had been insurance. Protection against the day Damien might decide she was a liability. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else. Evidence. Proof. A record of everything she'd built and everything she'd endured. Morrison picked up one of the flash drives. What's on these? Account records, mostly. Transfer histories, shell company documents, incorporation papers. Everything's labeled and organized by category. Keller was flipping through the papers, his expression growing more intense with each page. Jesus Christ, these are original documents, signatures, dates, everything. I was thorough. You were meticulous. Keller looked at her with something that might have been respect. This is Mrs. Carrera, this is enough to put away half the criminal organizations in the city. Just the ones my husband works with, Vivian said quietly. They loaded everything into evidence bags and drove back to the safe house in silence. Vivian watched the city pass by outside the window and wondered if she'd ever come back here, if she'd walk these streets again, or eat at her favorite restaurants, or see the skyline lit up at night. Probably not. Witness protection meant disappearing, and you couldn't disappear if you kept returning to the places you'd been. Back at the safe house, Morrison and Keller spread the documents across the dining room table like they were planning a military campaign, which, in a way, they were. This was war, just fought with evidence and testimony instead of guns. We're going to need you to walk us through all of this, Morrison said. Every document, every account, every name. It's going to take days, maybe weeks. I've got nothing but time. And so Vivian started talking again. She explained the structure of Damien's organization, drawing diagrams of how money flowed from one shell company to another, each layer adding legitimacy until criminal proceeds looked like ordinary business profits. She detailed specific transactions. The $2 million that went to Judge Reeves to dismiss charges against one of Damien's associates, the monthly payments to Senator Valdez in exchange for favorable legislation, the construction contracts awarded to Damien's companies in exchange for kickbacks to city officials. She gave them everything, and with each piece of information she felt lighter, like she was shedding weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. On the third day, Hayes came back with a final version of the immunity agreement. Vivian signed it without reading it again. At this point, the specifics didn't matter. She'd already jumped off the cliff. Whether she landed safely or crashed was out of her control now. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Chen said. He'd been spending most of his time at the U.S. Attorney's office, but he'd driven out for this conversation. Your assets. Vivian had been expecting this. What about them? You have significant personal wealth, over $40 million by our estimate. Money that was accumulated during your marriage to a man we're now prosecuting for racketeering and money laundering. That money is mine, Vivian said sharply. I earned it legitimately through investments in business ventures that have nothing to do with Damien. Can you prove that? Every penny. I've kept meticulous records. None of that money came from Damien's criminal activities. Chen studied her. You understand that we're going to verify that claim. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Over the next week, Vivian provided documentation for every account, every investment, every dollar she'd accumulated over the past 3 years. She showed them the legitimate businesses she'd built, the stock portfolios she'd managed, the real estate investments she'd made using money she'd earned through entirely legal means. It was true that she had used knowledge gained from working with Damien. She knew which companies were about to be acquired, which neighborhoods were about to be developed, which investments would pay off. But knowing something wasn't illegal. Acting on that knowledge through legitimate channels was just good business. Chen's investigators spent 4 days combing through her finances. When they were done, Hayes delivered the verdict with obvious reluctance. It's clean, she said. We can't find any direct connection between these accounts and Carrera's criminal proceeds. The money appears to have been earned through legitimate investment activities. Vivian felt something loosen in her chest. That money was her escape hatch, her safety net, her proof that she was more than just Damien's wife. If they'd taken it, she would have testified anyway. She'd already signed the immunity agreement. But this was better. This meant she'd walk away with something more than just her life. There is one complication, Chen said. Damien Carrera has filed for divorce. Vivian blinked. What? This morning, his attorney submitted papers claiming irreconcilable differences and requesting division of marital assets. Chen slid a document across the table. He's also claiming that you've stolen money from joint accounts and asking for a restraining order to prevent you from accessing any shared property. Vivian read through the filing, her hands surprisingly steady. It was exactly what she'd expected Damien to do: paint her as the villain, make himself the victim, try to control the narrative before she could. "He knows," she said quietly. "He knows I'm cooperating. We've been careful. Doesn't matter how careful you've been. Damien has sources everywhere. Someone saw me with you, or noticed I was missing, or put together enough pieces to figure it out." Vivian set down the papers. "The divorce is a message. He's cutting me loose before I can drag him down with me." "That's not how this works," Morrison said. "You're already cooperating. The divorce doesn't change anything. It changes how it looks. Right now, I'm a loyal wife turning on her husband. Once the divorce is public, I'm a scorned woman with an axe to grind. His lawyers will use it to undermine my credibility." "Let them try," Hayes said coldly. "We've got documentation. We've got financial records. We've got your testimony corroborated by physical evidence. A jury won't care whether you were married when you decided to cooperate." Vivian wasn't so sure about that, but she'd committed to this path, and there was no turning back now. That night, lying in the generic bedroom in the safe house that had become her entire world, Vivian thought about Damien filing for divorce, thought about him sitting in his lawyer's office, signing papers that would legally sever their connection. She wondered if he felt anything. Relief, maybe. Or anger that his useful, convenient wife had turned out to be his greatest liability. She wondered if he'd ever loved her at all, or if that had been another lie in a marriage built on lies. Her phone buzzed, the burner Morrison had given her. A text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake." Vivian's blood went cold. She grabbed the phone and walked quickly to the living room, where Rodriguez was watching television with the sound muted. "Someone just texted me." Rodriguez was on his feet instantly. "Show me." Vivian handed him the phone. Rodriguez swore and pulled out his own phone, calling Morrison. Within 5 minutes, the safe house was on lockdown. Agents checking windows and doors, Park doing a perimeter sweep. Morrison on his way back from wherever he'd been. "How did they get this number?" Vivian asked. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. "I don't know. This phone was clean. No one should have had access to it." Rodriguez was scrolling through settings, checking for tracking software or malware. Unless someone inside your organization is feeding information to Damien," Vivian finished. The possibility hung in the air like smoke. Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, along with 2 more agents and a technical specialist who immediately confiscated Vivian's phone. "We're moving you," Morrison said. "Tonight, new location, new team, complete communication blackout until we figure out how they got to you." "They'll find me again." "Maybe, but we'll make it harder." Morrison's expression was grim. "Mrs. Carrera, I need you to understand something. We're good at what we do. But Damien Carrera has resources we can't match and connections we can't control. There's a very real possibility that he'll find a way to get to you before trial." "So what are you saying? That I should recant? Disappear? Pretend none of this happened?" "I'm saying you still have options. We can arrange for you to leave the country, set you up somewhere Carrera can't reach you. You wouldn't testify, but you'd be safe." Vivian thought about it. About running, hiding, spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. About Damien walking free while she lived in fear. "No," she said. "I'm not running. I'm not spending the rest of my life afraid of him. We move forward." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then we move you tonight, and we tighten security. But Mrs. Carrera, if he finds you again, we might not be able to stop what happens next." "I know." They packed her meager belongings, the ill-fitting clothes from the safe house closet, the toiletries she'd been using, the burner phone that was now evidence. Vivian watched agents move through the house with practiced efficiency, erasing all signs she'd ever been there. Within an hour, she was in the back of an SUV with tinted windows, driving through the night to a location she wouldn't know until they arrived. Park sat beside her, Rodriguez drove, and 2 cars full of federal agents formed a convoy around them. Vivian watched the city lights fade behind them and thought about Damien getting that text message confirmation, that his warning had been delivered, that his soon-to-be ex-wife knew he was watching. She thought about how far she'd fallen from the woman who'd stood in a ballroom 2 weeks ago, smiling and raising money and playing the role of the perfect wife. And she thought about how far she still had to go before this was over. The new safe house was in the middle of nowhere, a farmhouse surrounded by empty fields and a single road that went on for miles in both directions. Harder to approach unseen, easier to defend. Vivian stood on the porch in the cold November air and looked out at the darkness, listening to the silence that was so different from the city noise she'd lived with for 12 years. Behind her, agents were setting up equipment and checking security systems, establishing the perimeter that was supposed to keep her alive. Vivian pulled her coat tighter and wondered if any of it would be enough. Then she went inside, because standing in the darkness made her too easy a target, and she wasn't ready to die yet. She still had too much left to destroy. The farmhouse became Vivian's prison and sanctuary all at once. Days bled into each other with a sameness that would have been comforting if it wasn't so suffocating. She woke, ate meals prepared by rotating agents, answered questions from prosecutors who drove out from the city, and went to bed in a room that smelled like dust and old wood. At night, she could hear the wind moving through the empty fields, a sound so different from traffic and sirens that it kept her awake for hours. On the 8th day at the farmhouse, Morrison arrived with news that made Vivian's stomach drop. "Damien's been arrested," he said without preamble. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night coordinating raids and processing evidence. "We executed warrants at 6 locations this morning. His penthouse, 3 business offices, a warehouse in the industrial district, and a property in his mistress's name." Vivian sat very still. "What did you find? Enough?" Morrison pulled out a chair and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Financial records that corroborate your testimony. Computers with encrypted files we're working on cracking, and about $4 million in cash hidden in the walls of that warehouse." "He'll make bail." "Probably. But it doesn't matter. The U.S. attorney is moving forward with RICO charges. We've got him on money laundering, racketeering, bribery, and about 15 other counts." Morrison paused. "We've also arrested Judge Reeves and Senator Valdez." Vivian closed her eyes. Judge Reeves had always been kind to her at charity events, making small talk about his grandchildren. Senator Valdez had written a generous check for legal aid just 3 weeks ago. They were corrupt, yes, but they were also human beings with families who would now watch them go to prison. Because of her. "How many people total?" she asked quietly. 16 arrests so far. More coming as we work through the evidence you provided." Morrison's voice gentled slightly. "I know this isn't easy. But these people made choices, Mrs. Carrera. They chose to break the law. You're just the one who finally held them accountable. That doesn't make it feel better. It's not supposed to. It's just supposed to be true." The arrests made national news. Vivian watched the coverage on the farmhouse television, volume low, while Agent Park pretended not to notice. The networks loved it, a sweeping organized crime case involving politicians and judges, all connected to a powerful businessman who'd operated with impunity for years. And at the center of it all, though the reporters didn't know it yet, was the businessman's wife. Vivian watched footage of Damien being led into federal court in handcuffs, his expression carefully neutral. He wore an expensive suit and walked with his shoulders back, projecting confidence even as prosecutors detailed the charges against him. His lawyer, some hotshot from New York that Vivian didn't recognize, argued for reasonable bail and promised his client would fight these baseless accusations. The judge set bail at $20 million. Damien posted it within 3 hours. "He's out," Morrison told her that evening. "Surrendered his passport, agreed to GPS monitoring, but he's out." "I knew he would be." His lawyer's already making noise about the case being built on unreliable testimony from a disgruntled spouse. "They're trying to get ahead of it before we reveal you as a witness." Vivian laughed, a harsh sound that didn't contain any humor. "Let them. It won't change what I know or what I can prove." But it did change things, in ways Vivian hadn't anticipated. With Damien out on bail and aware that his wife was cooperating, the threats became more pointed. Not directed at Vivian, the FBI had her too well protected for that, but at the people around her. Marcus called Morrison's office 3 days after Damien's release. Someone had broken into his apartment, trashed the place, and left a note that just said, "Tell her to stop." The charity Vivian had built received an anonymous donation of $1 with a memo line that read, Blood money from a traitor. I see. Patricia and Emerald Green posted on social media about the importance of loyalty, tagging several mutual friends and making thinly veiled references to people who betrayed those who'd given them everything. Vivian watched her old life cannibalize itself from a distance, powerless to stop it or explain or defend herself. The worst part was knowing that most people would believe Damien's version of events. She was the scorned wife, the woman who couldn't handle her husband's infidelity, so she burned down his life in revenge. Never mind that she'd spent 12 years building that life. Never mind that she had evidence of crimes that had nothing to do with marital problems. The narrative was simpler, cleaner, easier to digest if she was just an angry woman instead of a whistleblower. "You okay?" Park asked one evening, finding Vivian on the porch again, staring out at the darkness. "Define okay?" "Fair point." Park leaned against the railing beside her. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." "Do you?" "Yeah. I've been doing this job for 8 years. I've seen a lot of people who knew about crimes and said nothing because speaking up was too hard or too dangerous or too inconvenient. You didn't have to cooperate. You could have just divorced him and walked away." "I thought about it," Vivian admitted. "Would have been easier." "Easier doesn't mean better." Vivian turned to look at the agent. Park was younger than her by maybe 5 years, with the kind of quiet competence that came from being good at a difficult job. "Do you think we'll win at trial?" "Honestly, I don't know. Juries are unpredictable, and Damien's got enough money to hire lawyers who are very good at creating reasonable doubt." Park paused. "But I think you've got a real shot. The evidence is solid, your testimony is detailed, and you're credible in ways that matter. You're educated, articulate, and you're not asking for anything except immunity for crimes you committed under duress." "I wasn't under duress," Vivian said quietly. "That's the part people won't understand. I knew what I was doing. I knew it was illegal. I just didn't care because I thought we were building something together." "You were young." "I was 23, old enough to know better." "Maybe, but you're making it right now. That has to count for something." Vivian wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that 12 years of complicity could be balanced by a few months of cooperation. But she'd seen enough of the world to know that redemption wasn't a ledger where good deeds canceled out bad ones. Sometimes you just had to live with what you'd done and try to be better going forward. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in late December. Vivian wasn't required to attend. In fact, Morrison recommended she stay away, but she insisted on being there. She needed to see Damien's face when he realized she wasn't backing down. They brought her to the courthouse before dawn, entering through a service entrance while it was still dark. Morrison had arranged for her to watch from a private room with a video feed, keeping her away from Damien and his lawyers and the reporters who were camped outside, hoping for a glimpse of someone connected to the case. Vivian sat in that small room with Park beside her and watched on a screen as the courtroom filled. Damien entered with his legal team, still projecting that same confidence. He'd lost weight, she noticed. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. Good. Let him suffer a fraction of what she'd suffered. The prosecutor, Chen, who Vivian had come to respect for his methodical approach, laid out the government's case. Money laundering, racketeering, bribery, conspiracy. He detailed the shell companies and offshore accounts, the payoffs to public officials, the systematic corruption that had allowed Damien to operate with impunity for over a decade. And then he said the words Vivian had been waiting for. The government will be presenting testimony from a cooperating witness with intimate knowledge of the defendant's operations. This witness has provided documentation, financial records, and detailed testimony that corroborates and expands upon evidence gathered through independent investigation. Damien's lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, if the prosecution is relying on testimony from Vivian Carrera, we move to exclude it on the grounds that she's a hostile witness with clear bias against my client. Mrs. Carrera is currently engaged in a contentious divorce from Mr. Carrera and has significant financial motivation to— Your Honor, Chen interrupted smoothly, Mrs. Carrera's testimony is corroborated by hundreds of pages of documentation, much of which predates any marital discord. Her credibility can be challenged at trial, but the defense's characterization of her motivations is premature and speculative. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who looked like she'd heard every excuse in the book, held up a hand. Counselor, you'll have ample opportunity to challenge the witness's credibility at trial. For the purposes of this hearing, I'm satisfied that the government has presented sufficient evidence to proceed. Bail conditions will remain in effect. Trial is set for March 15th. The gavel came down, and it was done. Vivian watched Damien stand and turn to leave. For just a moment, his eyes swept the courtroom as if searching for someone. Searching for her. She wondered if he knew she was watching. If some part of him understood that the wife he'd dismissed as useful and nothing more had orchestrated his downfall from beginning to end. She hoped he did. She hoped he understood exactly who had beaten him. The weeks leading up to trial were a special kind of torture. Vivian spent her days preparing with Chen and his team, going over every detail of her testimony until she could recite it in her sleep. They practiced cross-examination, throwing hostile questions at her designed to rattle or confuse her. Isn't it true that you're only cooperating to avoid prison yourself? Yes. Isn't it true that you benefited financially from your husband's crimes? I benefited from being married to him, yes, but my personal wealth was earned through legitimate means. Isn't it true that you're angry at your husband for having an affair, and this is your revenge? I'm angry at my husband for a lot of things. The affair is pretty low on the list. Chen would stop the session after each round and provide feedback. Softer tone here, more detail there. Don't let them bait you into appearing emotional. Vivian absorbed it all, reshaping herself into the perfect witness. At night, alone in the farmhouse bedroom, she let herself be human again. She cried sometimes, though she couldn't always articulate what the tears were for. Lost time, maybe. Or the death of the person she'd been at 23. So certain she could build something beautiful with a man who'd never seen her as anything but useful. 3 weeks before trial, Morrison came to the farmhouse with someone Vivian hadn't expected to see. Mrs. Carrera, Morrison said, this is Serena Voss. She's asked to speak with you. Vivian stood slowly, staring at the young woman in the doorway. Serena looked different than she had at the gala, smaller somehow, with less polish and more fear. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a sweater that looked like they'd come from a department store clearance rack. What are you doing here? Vivian's voice came out colder than she'd intended. I needed to talk to you. Serena's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Agent Morrison said you might be willing to see me. Why would I be willing to do that? Because I want to help. I want to testify. Vivian looked at Morrison, who nodded confirmation. Ms. Voss came to us 2 days ago. She's got information about some of Damien's more recent operations, things that happened after you'd already started pulling back from his business. I don't understand, Vivian said to Serena. You were with him. You chose him. Why would you testify against him now? Serena's laugh was bitter. I chose him? No, Mrs. Carrera. I was 26 years old working as a receptionist when Damien decided he wanted me. You don't say no to men like him. You smile and nod and hope that if you play your role well enough, he'll take care of you when he gets bored. Vivian studied the younger woman, seeing things she'd missed at the gala. The way Serena held herself, like she was trying to take up less space. The careful neutrality of her expression. The same skills Vivian had developed over 12 years of marriage. What happened? Vivian asked quietly. After you left, after he got arrested, everything changed. He got paranoid, started accusing me of being an informant, of working with the FBI. Serena's voice cracked slightly. He hurt me, not badly enough to leave marks that would show, but enough to make his point. And then he told me exactly what would happen if I talked to anyone about anything I'd seen or heard. Morrison cleared his throat. Ms. Voss has visible bruising consistent with her account. We've documented it, and she's willing to testify about the assault as well as the financial crimes she witnessed. Vivian looked at this young woman who'd been sleeping with her husband, who'd worn diamonds Damien had bought while Vivian worked to hold his empire together. She should have hated her, should have felt satisfaction seeing Serena broken and scared. Instead, she just felt tired. Sit down, Vivian said, gesturing to the kitchen table. Tell me what you know. Serena sat, and over the next 2 hours she detailed operations Vivian hadn't been aware of. Newer schemes, more aggressive moves, deals that Damien had put together after Vivian had started pulling back. It was valuable testimony, corroborating the pattern of criminal behavior and showing that it had continued right up until his arrest. When Serena was done, she looked at Vivian with something that might have been shame or might have been exhaustion. I know you probably hate me. I would, if I were you. But I need you to understand, I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to survive. I know, Vivian said quietly. And she did. She understood what it was to bend yourself into shapes that fit someone else's needs, to lose yourself piece by piece while telling yourself it was a choice. Do you have somewhere safe to go? The FBI set me up in a hotel. I'm using a different name, staying away from places Damien might look. Good. Keep doing that. And Serena? Vivian waited until the younger woman met her eyes. When you testify, don't hold back. Tell them everything. Make him face what he did to both of us. Serena nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry. For all of it. I'm so sorry. I know, Vivian said again. Now go. Stay safe. After Serena left with Morrison, Park brought Vivian a cup of tea she hadn't asked for and sat across from her at the table. That was generous, Park said. Talking to her, helping her. I wasn't being generous, I was being practical. Her testimony strengthens the case. You could have refused to see her. Could have told Morrison to handle it without your involvement. Vivian wrapped her hands around the warm mug. She's not my enemy. She's just another woman who got caught in Damien's orbit and didn't know how to escape. Being angry at her would be like being angry at myself for all the years I stayed. You're not responsible for his choices. Neither is she. Park was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're going to be okay, you know, after all this. You're stronger than you think. Vivian wanted to believe that, but strength felt like a luxury when she was still just trying to survive each day. The trial started on a gray March morning with protesters outside the courthouse. Some supported Damien, holding signs that called the prosecution a witch hunt and demanded justice for an innocent businessman. Others supported the government's case, calling for accountability and an end to corruption. No one was there for Vivian. She was just the ghost in the machine, the woman whose testimony would make or break the case, but whose name most people still didn't know. Chen had decided to call her as the prosecution's primary witness, building the case around her testimony and using the documentary evidence to support it. It was a risky strategy, putting so much weight on a witness who could be portrayed as bitter and vengeful. But Chen believed the evidence was strong enough to withstand cross-examination. Vivian hoped he was right. They brought her into the courthouse through the same service entrance she'd used for the preliminary hearing, moving quickly to avoid reporters and photographers. She wore a navy suit that Chen's team had selected, professional but not expensive, serious but not severe. Everything about her appearance had been calibrated to project credibility. The witness room was small and windowless. Vivian sat alone with her thoughts, while somewhere nearby, jury selection was underway. Park stood outside the door, and Morrison checked in periodically to let her know how things were progressing. Jury seated, he told her on the afternoon of the second day. Opening statements tomorrow. You'll testify the day after. Vivian nodded. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together in her lap to hide it. You ready? Morrison asked. No, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's all anyone can ask. The night before her testimony, Vivian barely slept. She lay in the hotel room the FBI had moved her to for the duration of the trial, staring at the ceiling and running through Chen's questions in her head. She knew the answers. She'd practiced them 100 times. But knowing the answers wasn't the same as being ready to say them out loud in a courtroom full of strangers while Damien watched. She thought about the woman she'd been at 23, walking into a marriage with eyes wide open and heart full of hope. She thought about the woman she'd become over 12 years, brilliant and invisible, and slowly disappearing into the role she'd been given. And she thought about who she might become after this was over, assuming she survived it. Morning came too fast. Vivian dressed carefully, ate breakfast she couldn't taste, and rode to the courthouse in silence. Chen met her in the witness room and went over the key points one more time. Remember, he said, stick to the facts. Don't let the defense rattle you. If you don't know the answer to something, say so. Don't guess or speculate. I know. And Vivian? Chen's expression softened slightly. You've got this. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never had a witness as prepared as you are. Just tell the truth and let the evidence speak for itself. A bailiff appeared in the doorway. Mr. Chen, judge is ready. This was it. The moment Vivian had been building toward since that night at the gala when she'd stood outside Damien's study and heard the truth about what she meant to him. She stood, smoothed down her suit, and walked toward the courtroom. The doors opened and she saw the space she'd only watched on video before. The judge's bench, the jury box with 12 faces watching her enter, the gallery packed with reporters and observers. And there, at the defense table, Damien. He looked directly at her as she walked down the aisle. Vivian held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. She'd built his empire, she'd destroyed it, and now she was going to bury it for good. The bailiff directed her to the witness stand. Vivian placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Chen stood and approached, his expression calm and professional. Please state your name for the record. Vivian Marlowe Carrera. And what is your relationship to the defendant? Vivian looked at Damien one more time. Then she turned to the jury and said, I'm his wife, and I'm the person who built every illegal operation you're about to hear about. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge called for order. Chen smiled slightly, pleased that she'd gone off script, but understanding why. And Vivian began to talk, her voice steady and clear, telling the truth about 12 years of crimes she'd committed, and the man who'd convinced her they were building something beautiful when all they'd really built was a house of cards that had finally, inevitably, collapsed. She testified for 6 hours that day, walking the jury through shell companies and offshore accounts, explaining money laundering in terms anyone could understand, detailing payoffs and bribes with dates and amounts. Chen guided her through it methodically, building the case piece by piece. When court adjourned for the day, Vivian was exhausted but strangely calm. The hard part was over. She'd told the truth. Whatever happened now was out of her control. The cross-examination would come tomorrow, and Damien's lawyers would try to destroy her credibility. But Vivian had spent 12 years being invisible, being underestimated, being dismissed as just the wife. She was done being invisible. Let them come. She'd survived worse than hostile lawyers. She'd survived Damien. Damien's lead attorney was a man named Richard Hastings, famous for defending white-collar criminals and getting them acquitted through sheer force of personality and legal maneuvering. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of voice that could make accusations sound like friendly observations. He stood now, buttoning his suit jacket, and approached Vivian with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Carrera, he said warmly, like they were old friends. Thank you for your testimony yesterday. I know that couldn't have been easy. Vivian said nothing. Chen had warned her about this, the friendly opening designed to make her let her guard down. Now, you testified that you built these so-called illegal operations for my client. Is that correct? That's correct. And you did this willingly? No one forced you? I did it willingly, yes. So you're admitting under oath that you committed multiple felonies over the course of 12 years? Yes. Hastings paused, letting that sink in for the jury. And yet you're not being prosecuted for any of these crimes. Why is that? I was granted immunity in exchange for my cooperation. How convenient. Hastings' smile widened. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. You committed crimes. You're not facing any consequences for those crimes. And in exchange, you're testifying against your husband, the man you're currently divorcing in what I understand is a rather contentious proceeding? Chen stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Rephrase, Mr. Hastings. Certainly, Your Honor. Hastings turned back to Vivian. Mrs. Carrera, is it true that you and the defendant are currently involved in divorce proceedings? Yes. And is it true that there are significant assets at stake in that divorce? There are assets, yes. Assets you helped acquire through these criminal activities you've described? Vivian kept her voice level. Assets that were acquired through both legitimate and illegitimate means? Yes. And if my client is convicted, those assets become much easier for you to claim in the divorce, don't they? I have my own assets. I don't need his. Hastings raised an eyebrow. Your own assets? Please, elaborate. This was dangerous territory, but Vivian had prepared for it. Over the past 3 years, I built a legitimate investment portfolio separate from my husband's operations. Real estate, stocks, business ventures, all completely legal. How much is this portfolio worth? Approximately $42 million. A murmur went through the courtroom. Hastings' expression shifted slightly. He hadn't expected that number. $42 million, he repeated. And you earned this how exactly? Through smart investments and business acumen. While married to a man you now claim was running a criminal empire? Yes. Isn't it true, Mrs. Carrera, that you used knowledge gained from your husband's illegal activities to make those investments? Vivian met his eyes. I used knowledge gained from working in finance and understanding markets. The information was obtained legally, and the investments were made through legitimate channels. There's no law against being married to someone and also being smart. Someone in the gallery laughed, quickly stifled. Hastings' smile tightened. Let's talk about your marriage, he said. You were married to my client for 12 years, correct? Correct. And during that time, did he ever abuse you, threaten you, force you to do anything against your will? Vivian thought about the careful answer Chen had prepared for this. Physical abuse? No. But there are other kinds of control, Mr. Hastings. Other ways of making someone feel like they don't have choices. But you did have choices, didn't you? You're an educated woman. Yale Law School, top of your class. You could have left at any time. In theory, yes. In theory? Hastings' voice sharpened. Mrs. Carrera, you're a brilliant attorney. You understand the law better than most people in this courtroom. Are you really claiming you were somehow trapped in this marriage? I'm claiming that leaving felt impossible until it didn't. I'm claiming that I loved him, or thought I did, and that love makes people do things that don't make sense from the outside. Vivian's voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it now, real and raw. I'm claiming that I was 23 years old when I married him, and I thought we were building something together. By the time I realized what we'd actually built, I was so deep in it that leaving meant destroying myself too. But you left anyway. Eventually, yes. After he had an affair. The affair was part of it, but it was more than that. Hastings consulted his notes. On the night of your charity gala, you overheard my client speaking with Ms. Voss, his mistress, Vivian supplied. Speaking with Ms. Voss about you. And what you heard made you angry enough to start dismantling his business operations. Isn't that right? I started dismantling his operations because I finally understood that I was never a partner. I was a tool, and I decided I was done being useful to someone who saw me as nothing more than that. So this is revenge. No, Mr. Hastings, this is accountability. The cross-examination continued for another 3 hours. Hastings hammered at her credibility, her motivations, her immunity deal, the timing of her cooperation. He suggested she'd fabricated evidence, exaggerated Damien's role, invented crimes to make herself look like a victim instead of a willing participant. Vivian answered every question calmly, sticking to the facts, refusing to be baited into anger or defensiveness. When Hastings finally sat down, she felt like she'd run a marathon. Chen's redirect was brief. He walked her through the documentary evidence again, showing how her testimony was corroborated by bank records and emails and financial statements that couldn't be explained away as the invention of an angry spouse. When Vivian finally stepped down from the witness stand, her legs were shaking. But she'd done it. She'd survived. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. Serena testified, describing the operations she'd witnessed and the threats Damien had made after his arrest. Her bruises had faded, but the photographs were entered into evidence, showing purple marks on her ribs and arms. FBI agents testified about the raids, the evidence they'd seized, the pattern of criminal activity they'd uncovered. Forensic accountants walked the jury through money flows and shell companies, making the complicated simple. Damien's defense tried to paint everything as legitimate business that had been misconstrued by overzealous prosecutors and a vindictive wife. They called character witnesses who testified to Damien's generosity and business acumen. They brought in their own forensic accountants who offered alternative explanations for suspicious transactions. But they couldn't explain away the emails. They couldn't explain the cash hidden in warehouse walls. They couldn't explain why a legitimate businessman needed 14 offshore accounts in different names. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon. Chen was methodical and precise, walking the jury through the evidence step by step, showing how it all connected. He acknowledged that Vivian was a complicated witness with complicated motivations, but he argued that her testimony was supported by physical evidence that didn't lie. Hastings gave an impassioned defense, arguing that the government was criminalizing normal business practices and relying on the word of a woman with every reason to destroy her husband. He painted Damien as a victim of a vindictive spouse and an overzealous prosecution. The jury got the case on Friday evening. They deliberated through the weekend. Vivian waited in a hotel room, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything except those 12 people deciding her future. If they convicted Damien, she was free. If they acquitted him, she'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when he'd decide to even the score. Monday morning came with no verdict. Monday afternoon dragged by. Monday evening turned into another sleepless night. Tuesday morning, Morrison called. Jury's back. Verdict in 1 hour. Vivian, dressed in the same navy suit she'd worn for her testimony. Park drove her to the courthouse through morning traffic while Vivian tried to control her breathing. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, along with people whose faces Vivian recognized from Damien's world. Marcus was there, sitting in the back, and when he caught her eye, he nodded once, a gesture of support, or goodbye, or both. Damien sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. He looked thinner than he had at the start of trial, more drawn. When Vivian entered, he turned to look at her. Their eyes met for a long moment. Vivian couldn't read his expression. Anger, maybe, or resignation, or just exhaustion that matched her own. The jury filed in. Vivian tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral, looking straight ahead. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. The foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of racketeering, how do you find? Guilty. Vivian's breath caught. Around her, the courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge called for order. On the charge of money laundering? Guilty. On the charge of bribery of a public official? Guilty. It continued like that through all 23 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. With each verdict, Vivian felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, vindication, grief for what could have been if Damien had been a different man. When the last verdict was read, Damien sat very still. His lawyers were already huddling, talking about appeals and motions. But Damien just looked down at the table, his hands clasped in front of him. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then she turned to Damien. Bail is revoked. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. Federal marshals moved forward. Damien stood, allowing them to place handcuffs on his wrists. As they led him away, he looked back at the gallery one more time. His eyes found Vivian. For a moment, just a moment, something cracked in his expression. Understanding, maybe. Or just the final acceptance that the woman he'd dismissed as useful and nothing more had been the architect of his destruction. Then he was gone, escorted through a side door to begin a journey that would end with him in federal prison. Vivian sat very still while chaos erupted around her. Reporters were shouting questions. People were crying or celebrating. Chen was shaking hands with his team. Morrison appeared at her elbow. Let's get you out of here. They slipped out through the service entrance, avoiding the reporters and cameras. In the car, Vivian stared out the window at the city and felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a profound emptiness where her marriage and her old life used to be. You okay? Park asked from the front seat. I don't know, Vivian said honestly. Ask me in a year. Damien's sentencing happened 6 weeks later. The judge gave him 28 years in federal prison to be served without possibility of parole for at least 17. Judge Reeves got 12 years. Senator Valdez got 15. The other defendants received sentences ranging from probation to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement. Vivian didn't attend the sentencing. She'd said everything she needed to say in her victim impact statement, which Chen read on her behalf. It was short and factual, describing the emotional toll of being married to someone who saw her as a tool rather than a person. She didn't ask for leniency. She didn't ask for maximum punishment. She just told the truth and left the sentencing to the judge. The divorce was finalized 3 months after the trial ended. Damien signed the papers from prison, agreeing to a settlement that gave Vivian their personal assets, things that had been purchased with legitimate income, while everything tied to his criminal operations was seized by the government. Vivian walked away with less than she'd entered the marriage with, financially speaking, but she walked away free, with her $42 million portfolio intact and her immunity agreement honored. She didn't go back to the penthouse. She didn't want anything that carried memories of those 12 years. Instead, she sold what could be sold and donated the rest to the charity she'd built. Someone else would run it now, someone whose name wasn't synonymous with scandal and courtroom drama. For the first few months after the trial, Vivian lived quietly in a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one recognized her. She wore plain clothes and no makeup, cut her hair short, became invisible again, but in a different way. She attended therapy twice a week, working through 12 years of complicity and 3 months of testimony and a lifetime of making herself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. "What do you want?" her therapist asked during one session. "Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want?" Vivian thought about it for a long time. "I want to build something that's mine. Something clean and legitimate and impossible to take away." "Then build it." So she did. She started small, using a portion of her portfolio to invest in a startup that matched her values, a technology company working on financial literacy tools for low-income communities. The company was small but growing, run by a woman named Jennifer, who reminded Vivian of herself at 23 teats. Brilliant, driven, hungry to prove herself. Vivian became a silent partner at first, providing capital and advice without seeking recognition. But Jennifer kept asking her opinion on strategic decisions, kept valuing her input, kept treating her like a partner instead of just a check. Slowly, Vivian became more involved. She joined the board, started attending meetings, began using the skills she'd developed over 12 years to build something legal and meaningful. The company grew. Within a year, they'd expanded to 3 cities. Within 2 years, they were operating nationally. The financial literacy tools they'd developed were being used in schools and community centers, helping people understand money and credit and investment in ways that actually made sense. Vivian found herself working 80-hour weeks again, but this time the exhaustion felt different. This time, she was building something she believed in with people who valued her for more than what she could do for them. "You look happy," Jennifer said one evening after a board meeting. They were in the company's modest office, reviewing quarterly projections. "Different than when you first invested. Lighter, somehow." "I feel lighter," Vivian admitted. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Why did you invest in us? I know you had offers from bigger companies, more established businesses. Why take a chance on a startup run by someone you didn't know?" Vivian thought about how to answer that. "Because I spent 12 years building someone else's dream. I wanted to help someone build their own." Jennifer smiled. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you did. I couldn't have done this without you." Those words meant more than Jennifer probably realized. Someone seeing Vivian's value, acknowledging her contribution, treating partnership as something mutual rather than transactional. It was everything Vivian had wanted from Damien and never gotten. 3 years after the trial, Vivian attended a charity gala. Not one she'd organized. She was done organizing other people's events. This was a fundraiser for literacy programs, and she'd been invited as a major donor. She wore a dress she'd chosen herself, deep green instead of neutral tones, and she arrived alone because she didn't need someone on her arm to justify her presence. The event was smaller than the galas she used to organize, more intimate. People actually talked to each other instead of just networking. Vivian found herself enjoying it, engaging in conversations about books and education policy and the challenges of funding nonprofit work. "Mrs. Carrera?" Vivian turned to find a man she didn't recognize. He was maybe 45, tall with graying temples and smile lines around his eyes. He wore a suit that was expensive but not ostentatious, and he looked genuinely uncertain about whether he should have approached her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't mean to intrude. I just wanted to say hello. I'm Adrian Vale. I run a foundation that does similar work to what your company does." "Vivian," she said, shaking his hand. "And it's just Vivian now. I dropped the Carrera." "Vivian, then." Adrian's smile was warm. "I've been following your company's work. The financial literacy platform you've developed is impressive. We've been looking at potentially partnering with you to expand into rural communities. They talked for 20 minutes about programming and outreach strategies and the challenges of making financial education accessible. Adrian was knowledgeable and passionate, the kind of person who clearly cared more about impact than credit. When their conversation was interrupted by other guests, Adrian pulled out a business card. If you're interested in discussing a partnership, give me a call. I think we could do some real good together. Vivian took the card and studied it. Adrian Vale, Executive Director, Vale Foundation for Economic Empowerment, a legitimate organization doing legitimate work. I'll call you, she said. And she did, 3 days later. They met for coffee to discuss the potential partnership, which turned into lunch to continue the conversation, which turned into dinner a week later that had less to do with business and more to do with the fact that they enjoyed each other's company. Adrian was divorced, had been for 5 years. He had 2 teenage daughters who lived with their mother and whom he saw every other weekend. He was honest about his failures, the workaholic tendencies that had destroyed his marriage, the way he'd prioritized success over relationships. "I'm trying to do better," he said over coffee one morning. They'd been seeing each other for 2 months now, carefully navigating what was and wasn't a relationship. Not just say I'll do better, actually change. "How's that going?" Vivian asked. "Some days better than others, but I'm learning that success doesn't mean much if you're alone at the end of the day." Vivian understood that. She'd spent 3 years rebuilding herself, creating a life that was meaningful and successful by any measure. But there were still nights when the apartment felt too quiet, when she wondered if this was all there was. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said. "And you can tell me it's none of my business." "Ask." "The trial, your ex-husband. Does that ever feel like it's really over?" Vivian thought about it. "Yes and no. The legal part is over. He's in prison, I'm free, the debts are settled. But the emotional part? That's still ongoing. I'm still figuring out who I am without him, without that role I played for so long." "And who are you?" "I'm still working on that answer." Adrian reached across the table and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant. "I hope I get to be around when you figure it out." 6 months later, Vivian's company was acquired by a larger corporation for an amount that made headlines in the business press. She could have retired on her share alone, but instead she negotiated to stay on as an executive consultant, maintaining influence over the direction of the program she'd helped build. The Vale Foundation partnership had expanded beyond what either of them had initially envisioned, creating a comprehensive financial education system that was being implemented in schools across 12 states. And Vivian had moved in with Adrian into a house that was theirs rather than his or hers, in a neighborhood where no one knew her history or cared about her last name. On a Sunday morning in late fall, Vivian sat on the back porch with coffee and a newspaper, watching Adrian cook breakfast through the kitchen window. His daughters were visiting, and she could hear them laughing at something he'd said. She wasn't their stepmother. She'd been careful not to insert herself into that role without invitation. But she was someone who was around, who showed up and participated and treated them like people with their own thoughts and feelings. It was enough. Her phone buzzed with an email. The subject line made her freeze. From Marcus Chen. Subject: Thought you should know. Vivian opened it with shaking hands. Marcus wrote that Damien had been transferred to a medium security facility in Pennsylvania, that he was apparently teaching business classes to other inmates and working in the prison library, that he'd written to Marcus asking if Vivian was doing okay, whether she'd built the life she wanted. Marcus ended the email with, "I didn't respond, figured that was your choice to make. But I thought you'd want to know," he asked. Vivian stared at that email for a long time. Part of her wanted to write back, to send some message through Marcus that would let Damien know she'd survived his destruction and built something better in its place. But what would that accomplish? Damien was 17 years into a 28-year sentence. He'd lost everything: his empire, his freedom, his reputation, his wife. Making sure he knew she was happy felt like twisting the knife, and Vivian had discovered she didn't need that satisfaction anymore. She deleted the email and went inside. Adrian looked up from the stove. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Vivian said, and meant it. A year later, Vivian stood on a stage at a major business conference, accepting an award for innovation in financial education. The ballroom was full of people who knew her name because of her work, not her ex-husband or her testimony or the trial that had dominated headlines 4 years earlier. She gave a short speech about the importance of making financial literacy accessible, about empowering people with knowledge rather than keeping them dependent. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. As she walked off stage, she passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of herself. No longer invisible, no longer playing a role, no longer molding herself to fit someone else's expectations. Just Vivian. Finally, completely, triumphantly, herself. That night, Adrian took her to dinner at a small restaurant she'd mentioned wanting to try. Nothing fancy, just good food and quiet conversation. When dessert arrived, he pulled out a small box. Vivian's heart stopped. "Before you panic," Adrian said, "this isn't what you think it is. Or maybe it is, but with different parameters." He opened the box to reveal a key. "I bought a building," he said, "downtown near your office. I'm thinking of expanding the foundation, maybe creating a community center with educational programming and meeting spaces. But I need a partner, someone who understands this work and believes in it, and won't let me make it about ego instead of impact." "Adrian, I'm not asking you to marry me, Vivian. I'm asking you to build something with me, as equals, as partners, with your name on the door next to mine and full decision-making authority, and absolutely no subtext or hidden agenda." He smiled. "What do you say?" Vivian looked at the key, then at this man who'd somehow understood exactly what she needed. Not a proposal that would tie her to someone else's life, but an invitation to build something together, from scratch, with her contribution valued from the start. "I say yes," she said quietly. "I say let's build something beautiful." They worked on the community center for 18 months, transforming an abandoned building into something vibrant and alive. They offered financial literacy classes, legal aid workshops, small business counseling, and meeting space for community organizations. On opening day, Vivian stood in the lobby and looked at the wall where their names were listed as co-founders. Equal billing, equal authority, equal credit. She thought about the woman she'd been at 23, so desperate to matter that she'd built an empire for someone who'd never valued her. She thought about the woman she'd been at 35, standing in a ballroom at her own gala and realizing she'd become invisible. And she thought about who she was now, at 42, with gray starting to thread through her hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and a life that was entirely, authentically hers. She'd lost 12 years to Damien. She'd lost her name and her reputation and her naivete about what love could excuse, but she'd gained something too. The knowledge that she could survive her own destruction and build something better in its place. The understanding that being seen wasn't about making yourself useful, but about finding people who valued you for who you were. The certainty that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, and that strength wasn't about never breaking, it was about choosing to rebuild. Vivian walked outside to where Adrian was greeting the first visitors to their center. When he saw her, he smiled and held out his hand. She took it, and together they walked forward into a future she'd built for herself, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until finally she'd become exactly who she was always meant to be. Not the wife who knew too much, not the woman behind the man, not the invisible force holding someone else's empire together. Just Vivian, seen, valued, and finally free.